Welcome. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School and by the Program for Constitutional Government in the Great Green Government Department, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Our subject tonight is abortion, hotly debated in the country at large, but not at Harvard. In fact, this is, I think, the first public meeting that I know of which has been devoted to abortion at Harvard. Certainly the first public meeting that I know of in which the main speaker is against it. It's a strange condition we live under, where there seems to be more free speech outside the university than within it. And this is not because of any edict of the university administration or any other governmental body. It just seems to happen that there's a taboo topic here, at least when it's discussed in the negative. In the places which are most devoted to the intellect, there seems to be the least exercise of it in controversial issues. This has been called political correctness, and I think it illustrates the soft despotism that Tocqueville warned us against. Well, our speaker tonight is Mr. Nat Hentoff. He seems like such a New Yorker that you might not know that he was born in Boston and grew up here and wrote a wonderful book about it called Boston Boy. He graduated from Northeastern. He's a writer and a cultural and political critic. One of his specialties is jazz, and he's for a long time been associated with Downbeat magazine. But he also writes for the New Yorker, and he has a syndicated column for the Washington Post. But above all, he writes in Village Voice. He has written about 20 books, the most recent of which is called Free Speech for Me, but Not for Thee. He's a noted civil libertarian, to put it mildly. And if that weren't enough, we have tonight also a respondent, Alan Dershowitz, who's a professor at the Harvard Law School. Very shy fellow. Reclusive scholar who has consented to make a rare public appearance tonight. And he's written many books too, and his latest is actually a novel called The Advocate's Devil. We'll first hear Mr. Hentoff, and then Professor Dershowitz will come with a response for a few minutes. After that, questions from the floor. So then we have Nat Hentoff, and his title tonight is There's More to Abortion Than Abortion. Nat Hentoff.
As noted, there will be time for questions, denunciations, and hate speech. I've involved myself in many controversies through the years, from the First Amendment right of homegrown Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois, with its considerable number of Holocaust survivors, to my conviction that the speech of both Khalid Abdul Muhammad and Jesse Helms is protected by the First Amendment, and my using my own First Amendment rights to criticize Minister Farrakhan, which led a surrogate of his to tell a college audience a couple of years ago that I am the Antichrist. Alas, he did not leave a job description. But by far the most fiercely controversial position I've ever been identified with is my decision to be pro-life about 10 years ago. It was a decision that surprised me at the time. Until then, it had never occurred to me that there was a rational other side to the question of abortion. It seemed to me that what little I knew personally of the pro-lifers, which was very little indeed, indicated that they were all committed Christians, and therefore abortion to them was a religious issue. And I am an atheist, a Jewish atheist. It's a different sect. In any case, having spent my first 28 years in Boston, I had known during that period only one pro-lifer. She was the wife of a jazz bass player, and she was Catholic. I liked her a lot, one of the most honest people I've ever known, but I ascribed her views on abortion to her having been brought up Catholic. Everyone else I knew, students, musicians, journalists, labor organizers, professors, everyone else was unconditionally pro-abortion. In Massachusetts, in those days, there was an extra edge, an extra impetus to being for abortion rights. The Catholic Church was so powerful with regard to legislative decisions that just about any proposed bill of which the Cardinal disapproved never made it to a vote. And above all else, the Cardinal, William O'Connell, they used to call him Gangplank Bill because he liked to go on long vacations, the Cardinal would not countenance any measure that might in any way lead to a softening of the criminal prohibition against abortion. The father of the jazz bass player that I just mentioned had some years before been involuntarily shown by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts how harsh those criminal penalties were. He was an eminent physician in a suburb of Boston who decided when he was in his 50s that he could no longer bear the suffering of women who desperately wanted an abortion and had no way to get one. There was at the time a legendary doctor in rural Pennsylvania for a small fee, but he was getting old and couldn't accommodate all who wanted his services. So this physician in Massachusetts started to perform abortions at no fee. It was a matter of conscience, he said. Somehow the police found him out, and he was sentenced to prison for 10 years and was stripped of his right to practice medicine. That story stayed with me, and from the time I came to New York in 1953 as an editor of Downbeat, I didn't stray from the pro-choice creed. I was on the board of the New York Civil Liberties Union when it was a key factor in the successful struggle to make abortion legal in New York State before Roe v. Wade. My wife Margot, then and now, is a ferocious defender of a woman's right to end a pregnancy and has utter disdain for all pro-lifers, including intermittently me. I started to become a pariah among most of my friends and colleagues in 1983. An infant, initially called baby Jane Doe, had been born on Long Island with spina bifida. That's a lesion in the spinal column. If it's not repaired quickly through surgery, there's danger of infection that can lead to permanent brain damage. Usually there's also an accumulation of spinal fluid in the skull. As soon as possible, a shunt should be inserted to drain the fluid. Otherwise, the pressure on the brain often leads to mental retardation. The parents of baby Jane Doe decided, however, that she would not have the operation or the shunt. She was only to have, to use newspeak, conservative treatment, antibiotics, until she died. I found out in the course of doing the story that she'd had two doctors. The first doctor told her to have the operation, put in the shunt. The second doctor said, don't do anything and the child will slip away. All the press, print and broadcast, including 60 Minutes, which did a disgracefully inaccurate story on baby Jane Doe, got all the medical facts wrong for openers. Ed Bradley was responsible in part for that. All the press vigorously supported the parents. They listened to the parents' lawyer, who was very articulate, and printed the alleged facts without checking them. The infant would, no matter what you did for her, she wouldn't live long, maybe 2 or 3 years. She would be in intractable pain for all of her brief life and would never recognize her parents. It was an act of compassion to let the child slip into eternity. When the press, print and broadcast, are unanimous on anything, I get suspicious as a journalist. Nothing is that. So I found the names, no big deal, I found the names of the 3 leading pediatric neurosurgeons in the country. And I called them. They were aware of the infant's condition. It was all over the papers around the country by then. And the records had not yet been sealed in the hospital. They were later sealed. They knew the particular location of the lesion in her spine, and each of them told me that if an operation was performed very soon, and if a shunt were inserted in the skull, the child would, at worst, have to walk with braces as she grew up. She would not be retarded, she would not be in intractable pain, and she certainly would recognize her parents. So I began writing in opposition to the parents, their lawyer, and the press. Just about everybody in the newsroom at the Village Voice thought I was balmy. This was a damaged kid. Why waste all this space on her? Besides, pro-lifers were supporting her. They're about the only ones who were supporting her right to live and to aggressive treatment, so be careful about the company you keep. On the other hand, I was becoming uncomfortable about the company I had kept for years. I heard Janet Benshoff, who was then head of the Reproductive Freedom Rights Unit of the ACLU, a very good litigator. Janet was saying in a lecture that this case was really an extension of reproductive freedom rights, women's rights to control their own bodies. The mother of baby Jane Doe had every right to extend that right to make any decision she wanted to with regard to her child. The American Civil Liberties Union officially insisted that there be no interference by any governmental body in the future of baby Jane Doe. Privacy rights were at stake, the mother's privacy right. It was at this point that Dr. C. Everett Koop appeared in the newsroom at The Voice. I had asked him to come because I wanted some technical information. He had been for many, many years one of probably the leading pediatric surgeon in the country at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, where he'd done some extraordinary operations. But he was also identified, once he was nominated to be Surgeon General, as being pro-life. So when he appeared in the newsroom, everybody froze. I mean, the expressions were of hatred and disgust, directed first at him, then at me. And what they were doing, obviously, was they were reacting to a stereotype. They had no idea what his background was as a pediatric surgeon. It was like some of the white folks in Alabama back in the 50s or 60s when a black man like E.D. Nixon of Montgomery walked into a room. Anyway, the thing that began to hit me was, this was not a fetus. This was a born child. And as Harry Blackmun emphasized in Roe v. Wade, once you're born, you're a person under the Constitution. That means you have the right to due process, independent of your mother's right to let you die, and you have the right to equal protection of the laws. You can't exercise that right as an infant, but somebody can for you, and that's what Koop was trying to do. Janet Benshoff thought, she told a mutual friend, that I must have become a born-again Christian. But there I was, still a Jewish atheist. My comrades at the ACLU thought the same thing, at least that I had taken a very strange turn. Now, to my surprise then, the people I knew, liberals and civil libertarians, among them reporters and editors and staffers in Congress, could not understand where I was coming from. Many of them saw the life of baby Jane Doe as dependent on the priorities of the mother. The kid could cost a lot of money and emotional distress if you kept it. So it would be understandable if she were to be sent back. Not killed, that's a terrible word. Just allowed to die. I heard that phrase a lot. This attitude among pro-choicers made me start thinking. I began to read the medical textbooks that physicians in prenatal care read. Not pro-life books, standard texts, like The Unborn Patient, Prenatal Diagnosis and Treatment, by Harrison, Golbus, and Philly, published by W.B. Saunders in Philadelphia, a division of Harcourt Brace. God is nowhere mentioned in the book. Chapter 1 begins, the concept that the fetus is a patient, an individual whose maladies are a proper subject for medical treatment, as well as scientific observation, is alarmingly modern. Only now are we beginning to consider the fetus seriously, medically, legally, and ethically. And I read about the growing sophistication of fetal surgery, operations on the fetus that remedy various defects. But the same fetus the next day can legally be killed by abortion. I spoke to a number of physicians who do research in prenatal development, and they told me that human life is a continuum from fertilization to birth to death. One of them, for example, Dr. C. Ward Kisher, it is an undeniable truth that the embryo is as much a human being as an adult. This is so because from the moment of initial contact of the sperm and ovum, all development to birth is committed and is a fait accompli. In other words, if you don't kill it, The kid may grow up to dig Charlie Parker or read the editorials, I hope not, in the New York Times. Every point in time is part of a continuum, he said. Therefore, every point in development derives its significance from the previous point. Scientific spin doctors have invented and promoted such bogus biology as pre-embryo and stages of individuality. You know, when does the fetus begin to feel pain? And have duped many physicians who know little about human embryology. The Nuremberg trials settled this question conclusively, that is, the ones who were doing human embryo experimentation. Well, not conclusively. I must say it's the first good thing I've heard from Bill Clinton since he's been in office or before. He stopped some of the embryo research, but not all of it. Anyway, that's what began to shape my decision to become a pariah. By the way, Justice Brennan told me this some years ago. You know, at the court, drafts circulate before the final opinion is printed and announced. And Harry Blackmun's drafts for Roe v. Wade took a very long time. And Brennan, who is very pro-choice and who was a devout Catholic who used to go to Mass, he may still do it every Saturday, so there's another stereotype you have to deal with. Brennan said he did advise Blackmun, to no avail, to cut out the trimesters, because he too saw this as a continuum. And he said sooner or later science is going to overtake you, and the trimesters will cause you a lot of trouble. Anyway, it is what I finally came to a conclusion, as you can see, is it is the life of a developing human being that is being killed. The euphemisms for an aborted fetus, the product of conception, and a clump of cells are what George L. Orwell might have called newspeak. As time went on, I began to understand that there is much more to abortion than abortion itself. The mindset, the ability to regard as just and necessary the aborting of at least 1.3 million developing human beings a year helps strengthen the consistent ethic of death in this nation. My sense of myself as a liberal began to weaken somewhat. Not that I saw myself as a conservative either. And it really began to, I questioned who my allies were, at least in this area, during an attempt to give handicapped infants due process so that their parents would not summarily end their lives. In 1984, a coalition of disability rights groups and some pro-lifers began to lobby Congress to pass a bill to extend the Child Abuse and Treatment Act. One section would broaden the definition of child abuse to include the denial of medical treatment or nutrition to infants born with life-threatening conditions. I'd been reading in the Archives of Internal Medicine how, for example, at that time, at least 500 Down syndrome kids were killed by physicians, with the parents' assent. But of course, the death certificates did not indicate how they died that way. Furthermore, in this proposed section of the bill, each state, to keep getting funds for child abuse programs, would have to put in place a reporting system that could be alerted whenever a handicapped infant was being abused by denial of treatment or food. There were many documented cases of that. I covered the development of that bill over about 8 or 9 months, almost on a daily basis. And I made suggestions to some of the staffers. A columnist can do that, a reporter can't. It finally passed with language that was not as strong as it ought to have been, but historically, that section of the bill was a vital beginning in making it more difficult for physicians to end the life of an infant because the life wasn't worth anything, and then put on the death certificate an entirely false report. Natural causes, for example. During the debate in Congress, I was most impressed with a comment by Illinois Congressman Henry Hyde, a pro-lifer much scorned by liberals, who is, by the way, superb on free speech issues, but nobody wants to see that either. I suggest, he said, that a question of life or death for a born person ought to belong to nobody, whether they are parents or not. The Constitution ought to protect that child because they are handicapped. They are not to be treated differently than if they were women or Hispanics or American Indians or blacks. Their handicap may be a mental condition or a physical condition, but by God, they are human, and nobody has the right to kill them by passive starvation or anything else. What about the liberals in the House? There was a parade on the floor of ardent pro-choicers and champions of the powerless, many of whom I know and respect except for this kind of thing. They voted against the proposed law. Among them, John Conyers, Geraldine Ferraro, Ron Dellums, Don Edwards, Robert Kastenmeier, Gary Studs, George Crockett, David Obey, Pat Schroeder, Tom Downey, Henry Waxman, Barney Frank, nobody to believe in anymore, Charles Rangel, Edward Markey, and the longtime chairman of at that time, of the Judiciary Committee, a very effective liberal, Peter Rodino. In a passionate speech on the floor, Geraldine Ferraro spoke for her pro-choice liberal colleagues in focusing on the parents' right of privacy to make life and death decisions for handicapped newborns. Not a word about the newborn's right to be supported by the law to live. Increasingly, I realized there was more to abortion than abortion. The privacy right to kill, established in Roe v. Wade, was spreading across the land. During the 1980s, I tracked every final court decision in the individual states on euthanasia, for example, withdrawing feeding tubes or respirators. And every one cited Roe v. Wade as a key precedent for terminating life. The privacy right to end the life of the fetus was extended to end the surrogate right to end the life of a husband, a wife, or children who were comatose or appeared to be. There's more to abortion than abortion. At a conference on euthanasia at Clark College in Worcester, I met Derek Humphrey, the angel of death. Jack Kevorkian is only the pretender. Humphrey is originally from England. As you know, he's founded the Hemlock Society here. And he told me that for some years in this country, he had great difficulty getting his message across. The message being various compelling ways of self-administered suicide, physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, all the many splendid doors of death. But then, Humphrey said, but then a wonderful thing happened. It opened all the doors for me. What was the wonderful thing, I asked? Roe v. Wade. Early this year, Barbara Rothstein, Chief Judge of the Federal District Court in the state of Washington, became the first judge in the history of the nation to declare physician-assisted suicide constitutional. She likened the freedom of the terminally ill to end their lives to a woman's fundamental right to an abortion. She cited two abortion rights decisions, Roe v. Wade, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. There was nothing in her decision that pointed out that some of the people, there are simple people who are in such terrible state, physically, whatever, that they do want to commit suicide. But there are many who are depressed, clinically depressed, and many doctors do not know how to diagnose that. And many who are in great pain are being treated by doctors who know very little about treating pain. If you are poor, especially, and getting the kind of medical help that poor people usually get, except in emergency rooms, then you're all the more vulnerable to physician-assisted suicide. None of that was in her decision. 20 or so years ago, there was a man who foresaw what was coming if the right to an abortion became legal throughout the pregnancy. And it is. On the same day Roe v. Wade came down, Doe v. Bolton was decided by the Supreme Court, and the court ruled that a woman had the right to an abortion at any point for psychological, emotional reasons. So there are legal third trimester abortions, not in every state. In Colorado, Dr. Warren Hearn is a leading principal in these kinds of operations. And he says, every day I feel I've made a small difference in the world. Yes, I'm doing something very important for freedom. Whose freedom? Anyway, there was this angry prophet back then who said what happens to the mind of a person and the moral fabric of a nation that accepts the aborting of the life of a baby without a pang of conscience? What kind of a society will we have 20 years hence if life can be taken so casually? Same man said back then there were those who argue that the right of privacy is of a higher order than the right of life. That was the premise to slavery. You could not protest the existence or treatment of slaves on the plantation because that was private and therefore outside of your right to be concerned. Also, in the late 1970s, this man told of how he himself had almost been aborted. The doctor had told his mother to let him go, but she refused. Don't let the pro-choicers convince you, he said, that a fetus isn't a human being. That's how the whites dehumanized us by calling us niggers. The first step was to distort the image of us as human beings in order to justify that which they wanted to do and not even feel they'd done anything wrong. The person I've been quoted, as I guess you've guessed, is Jesse Jackson. He became pro-choice when he decided to run for president. He figured that's where the votes were. Last year, I saw him on a train, and we talked for a while about habeas corpus and the death penalty. Finally, I told him I'd been quoting the former pro-life Jesse Jackson because his writings on the subject were among the most powerful I knew. He looked troubled, and I asked him if he had any second thoughts on having reversed his views on abortion. He looked a little more troubled, and then he said, "I'll get back to you on that." I haven't heard from him since. Not all present pro-lifers, I should say, have welcomed me into the fold, or in any case have answered some of my questions as to their consistency. I know Henry Hyde because of the free speech stuff he's involved in. And the last time I saw him, I said, "How come you are pro-life, but you're also so strongly for capital punishment?" He told me he'd get back to me on that. A more basic division between me and some pro-lifers was dramatized during the Reagan years. I was invited to address the annual convention of pro-lifers in Ohio, in Columbus. I was invited as a welcome novelty, a Jewish atheist civil libertarian who wrote for the Village Voice and who had gotten the message and could be displayed like in a carnival show to show the diversity of the movement. The event was held in a large field with tables set up for the many who had come. I was at a rickety podium facing them. I suggested rather strongly that if they were truly pro-life, they should be opposing capital punishment, nuclear armament, big issue at the time, and they should be vigorously protesting the Reagan budget, which had cut funds for the women, infant, children, the WIC program that provided diet supplements and medical checks for mothers and children in poverty. I also said that Ronald Reagan, alas, was exemplifying Barney Frank's old line, that pro-lifers were pro-life only up to the moment of birth. Well, the faces immediately before me began to close, and farther back I could hear fists being pounded on tables and shouts and growls. And then people actually began to advance on the podium. The then head of the National Right to Life Committee, Jack Wilkie, was sitting beside me, and I said to him, "Jack, I had not quite made up my mind to give up my life for this cause." As it turned out, they were not intending a physical assault, but they were eager, very eager, to prove to me that my failure to understand the consistency of their values and Ronald Reagan's values was due to my not yet having found God. And later in the mail, I received several Bibles. Pretty good Bibles. I have more trouble, of course, with people on the left. At the Village Voice, where I've been since 1958, 3 editors, all women, stopped speaking to me after my first pro-life piece there. My wife does that on all the weeks. In 2 of the cases at the Voice, I didn't feel much of a loss. The third woman is now the editor-in-chief, Karen Durbin, and we have agreed that there are other things we can talk about. In speaking to people on the left, I have told them, without much success, about Mary Meehan. Mary was active for years in the anti-war and civil rights movements, and she wrote a piece for The Progressive in which she noted, "Some of us who went through the anti-war struggles in the 1960s and 1970s, and now active in the Right to Life movement. We do not enjoy opposing our old friends on the abortion issue, but we feel we have no choice. It is out of character for the left to neglect the weak and helpless. The traditional mark of the left has been its protection of the underdog, the weak and the poor. The unborn child is the most helpless form of humanity, even more in need of protection than the poor tenant farmer or the mental patient. The basic instinct of the left is to aid those who cannot aid themselves. And that instinct is absolutely sound. It's what keeps the human proposition going. Agreeing with that instinct is Feminists for Life of America, my favorite advocacy group of any kind. Its founders in the 1970s also came out of the civil rights and anti-war movements, and it keeps growing in numbers and impact. Its credo is, we oppose all forms of violence, including abortion, euthanasia, and capital punishment, as they are inconsistent with the core feminist principles of justice, nonviolence, and non-discrimination. Its first president, Rachel McNair, was arrested at least 17 times for protesting against nuclear plants and weapons, for passing out leaflets on abortion on clinic property, as well as for sitting in front of abortion clinic door. Somehow Rachel and her colleagues are not much mentioned in the press. They don't fit the stereotypes of pro-lifers as looking like Jesse Helms and wanting to expand capital punishment to all artists who traffic in indecency. I'll give you a quick story about the press. 3 years ago, on a weekend, pro-abortion forces held a really extraordinarily large rally in Washington. And for the week before, the Washington Post gave it great coverage, interviews, analysis of their goals, and the day before the rally, which was on a Saturday, they printed a map of how to get there. A year later, the pro-lifers had a very large rally in Washington. Nothing at all in the week beforehand. I picked up the Washington Post in New York on a Sunday. I'm looking, nothing on the front page, nothing in the A section. And then I finally decided to look, obviously, in the Metro section, and deep in the Metro section there's a column and a half about the pro-life rally. At the time, the Washington Post had a very good ombudsman. An ombudsman is there are only about 32 in the whole country, unfortunately. An ombudsman is hired by a newspaper to criticize the newspaper, to do it internally with memos, etc., and to do it usually once a week in a column. They wind up invariably not having any friends left on the paper. If they do, they haven't done a decent job. Richard Harwood was the guy then, and he pointed out, he's not pro-life, but he pointed out this was a hell of a lousy way to cover two events that should have gotten at least reasonably equal coverage. The managing editor of The Voice got very angry and summoned all the people involved in the weekend editions and said, how the hell did this happen? And one of them finally spoke up and said, we don't know any pro-lifers. We didn't think there was anything important about this. They do now. And the managing editor is not pro-life either. But there is a press critic on the Los Angeles Times who spent 4 months traveling around the country talking to editors and journalists and people like Kate Michelman and pro-lifers on the other side. And he wrote a series of articles indicating very clearly that there is no attempt even at being fair in the columns of most newspapers, because they really don't. It's like I was in Boston. Most reporters and editors don't see that there's any other position that's worth talking about. Anyway, largely omitted from the press are the views of those who regard, on the pro-choice side, who regard abortion as an essential purifier of the species. The ones who do that exempt themselves as users of abortion, but they do mean those inferior others. In New York, when abortion was legalized in 1971, an editorial on WCBS radio celebrated the breakthrough by saying that abortion, quote, is one sensible method of dealing with such problems as overpopulation, illegitimacy, and possible birth defects. It is one way of fighting the rising welfare rolls and the increasing number of child abuse cases. I think we should be grateful that Newt Gingrich is pro-life. I've heard this often from some pro-choicers who prefer not to speak in this vein publicly, but are quite open about the extra dividends of abortion as they apply to a safer and more aesthetically pleasing society. In 1992, Nicholas von Hoffman wrote in the New York Observer, "Free, cheap abortion is a policy of social defense. To save ourselves from being murdered in our beds and raped on the streets, we should do everything possible to encourage pregnant women who don't want the baby and will not care for it to get rid of the thing before it turns into a monster. At their demonstrations, the anti-abortionists parade around with pictures of dead and dismembered fetuses. The pro-abortionists should meet these displays with some of their own, pictures of the victims of the unaborted, murder victims, rape victims, mutilation victims, pictures to remind us that the fight for abortion is but part of the larger struggle for safe homes and safe streets." More to abortion than abortion. Less inflammatory than Nicholas von Hoffman is Brian Lira, a very good talk show host on WNYC, which is in New York, which is part of National Public Radio. It's probably the most civilized talk show in the country except for McGinty in Washington. Brian Lira has said on the air that we save a lot of money if we allow medical funding of abortions for poor women. A lot less kids will be on welfare. And what a blessing that will be for them. On the other hand, picketing before the White House during the debate about health care reform, a black woman was holding a placard. "Abortion shouldn't be part of a health care bill. Pregnancy is not a disease." But being pro-life can be considered a disease of the mind and spirit. A year or so after I declared myself a pro-lifer, I was invited to speak on this startling heresy at a college in upstate New York. 2 weeks before the lecture, it was canceled. The women on the lecture committee, I was told by the embarrassed professor who had asked me to come, had decided that there was a limit to the kind of speech the students could safely hear, and my topic was decidedly outside that limit. I was told, however, that I could come the next year to give a different talk. Even the women on the committee would very much like me to speak about something I had written a lot about, censorship. I went and spoke about censorship at that college. There is a fear among many pro-choicers that pro-lifers can have too much free speech. Near Syracuse this year, I was there about 3 weeks ago, a billboard high above the expressway has been vandalized 4 times. The intensity of the perpetrators' desire to censor was impressive, as they found perilous ways to climb onto that billboard. The defacers were abortion rights activists, scandalized by the effrontery of the Western New York chapter of Feminists for Life in putting up this message. And this is there were 2 messages. First message was, abortion has 2 victims, 1 dead, 1 wounded. Second message was a phone number, and it provided, as alternatives to abortion, access to 8 different agencies providing prenatal care, housing, free financial and medical assistance, parenting classes, and adoption counseling. Each time the billboard was attacked, the phone number was crossed out. What were those people afraid of? And another college in that area, a young woman, a student, told me that at the library in the college, there were a lot of posters up all the time, different posters changing. And she tried to put up pro-life posters, and they were always torn down. And she said, I don't understand it. What are they afraid of? I don't know myself, except to speculate. As I told her, a lot of people on the pro-choice side were still are very angered at Life is a Beautiful Choice, you know, that series of ads? And maybe it puts some doubt into people's minds. NARAL in New York was raising funds to put on a series of television ads to counter Life is a Beautiful Choice. And I'm waiting for them because I can't wait to see this, how they visualize death as a beautiful choice. There are messages that bear too much reality to be borne. In the American Feminist, the national magazine of Feminists for Life, Barbara Newman has written, "If it is wrong to kill with guns, bombs, or poison, with the electric chair or the noose, it is most tragically wrong to kill with the physician's tools. But is abortion killing?" She said, "Euphemism kills." End of formal part of the evening. My part, anyway. Thank you.
Thank you, Nat Hentoff, and now Professor Dershowitz for a response.
I may not be shy, but this is a difficult evening for me because Nat Hentoff is one of my favorite people in the world, one of my true heroes, one of my mentors, on issues of free speech, capital punishment, and many of the issues which are central to my life. We agree 100%. We disagree on the atheism business. I'm a Jewish agnostic. And I'm reminded a little of Woody Allen's story about when he married an atheist Catholic woman, and they had this big argument about what religion to not bring their children up in. But on the other hand, tonight, we can see the perfect scientific experiment. Here we have two people who agree on everything in the world. There really are few people who are closer to my views on the range of subjects, but yet we fundamentally disagree on this major issue. Even on this issue, I agree with much of what Nat has said tonight, except for the therefore. And the therefore, of course, is a very big issue. And I want to illustrate our difference by starting with a story from one of my favorite Jewish agnostic sources, the Talmud. And it's the story of a class being held in law, not a particularly religious subject. And the Rabbi Eliezer, starts by teaching the usual rule that says, if a fledgling bird is found within 50 cubits of a person's property, it belongs to the owner of the property. But if the valuable bird is found outside the limits of 50 cubits, it belongs to the person who found it. Rabbi Jeremiah asked the following question: what if 1 foot of the fledgling bird is within 50 cubits and 1 foot is outside it? What is the law? And here's what the Talmud says, quote, "It was for asking this question that Rabbi Jeremiah was thrown out of the house of study." Now, Nat and I would agree that there was certainly censorship here, but I love that story because I went to yeshiva, house of study, and I used to ask questions like that, and I used to get thrown out repeatedly. My teachers would call those questions klutz kashas, questions that would only be asked by a klutz. And it's been 31 years now teaching at Harvard Law School, and it's finally come to me that those are the most important questions. That the difference between a civilized society and an uncivilized society is the understanding that we must draw lines. That to live in a society, we must draw lines, we must balance. Life is a continuum. I agree with that. There are no absolutes here. I agree that we hear a lot of euphemisms about pre-embryonic stages and trimesters. That's all nonsense. Life is a continuum. The question is, do we have a choice as to where to draw that continuum? If you're religious, and if you believe the soul begins at a particular point in time, you have no choice. You have to accept the religious dogma of when life begins, but we share the virtue of freedom of thought. We do not have to accept a dogma. And I believe that we trivialize human life, adult, conscious human life, when we equate it with a newly fertilized egg. We have to ask, on what type of continua are we going to draw the line? One can imagine many continua, rational continua, on which a monkey, an orangutan, other kind of a dolphin, has much more in common with a thinking adult human being than does a fetus. So there's nothing absolute that says that's the continuum rather than something else, if you don't believe in the soul. And we must agree on that. You are free to resolve your issues of soul any way you choose, and that may determine where you stand on the debate. When you reject the soul, or are agnostic about it, then the argument comes down to biology. And here's where I think Nat falls into the fundamental naturalistic fallacy. To assume that from biology, one can derive morality. I'm prepared to accept all the biology that Nat quotes, but I am not willing to accept my morality from biologists. The biologists can simply give us the data on which to make an informed moral decision. What should that informed moral decision be? Well, I'm certainly influenced by one of Nat's very powerful arguments, the argument about the slippery slope. And he's absolutely right about that. The issue of abortion has become an argument stopper. It has become a basic underpinning for many other arguments which have little to do with abortion. The title of the talk is brilliant, as was its implementation. I do really believe that many people, particularly within the women's movement today, have used abortion as a surrogate for women's power. And I think that we have to understand that when children or children's rights are used as a surrogate for adult rights, that a good deal of skepticism has to be employed. Let me give you just two examples to try to demonstrate my point. I believe that a woman has the right to choose abortion. I believe that at any stage, we will come back and perhaps talk about what that means, but at any reasonable stage, a woman has the right to decide that, on balance, looking at the rights of her privacy versus the rights of the fetus, that her rights should prevail, and she can choose to terminate the life of the potential human being she has brought into existence. I'm going to put aside what rights the man may have, who contributed to the fertilization process. Let's focus on the woman's right. Most feminists I know take that argument and push it to its logical, illogical conclusion that since a woman has the right to terminate life within her body, she also has the right to treat that life within her body any way she chooses, and the greater society has no power to protect that fetus whether the woman has chosen death or life. I fundamentally disagree. While agreeing that a woman has the right to terminate life and abort the fetus, I fundamentally disagree that a woman who has chosen to bring that fetus to life, who has decided to give birth and present to the world a person with a 75-year life expectancy, that woman has the right to ingest drugs, to irresponsibly ingest alcohol, and to knowingly expose that future life which she has chosen to bring to life to a life full of preventable tragedy. So there, I think, if one takes a logical argument and a moral argument, one splits with the power arguments of much of the feminist movement. Let me give you another striking example. In India today, there is a great debate among feminists, and that debate is carried over to the shores, as to whether or not a pregnant woman should have the right to be told the sex of her fetus, precisely in order to determine to have an abortion only if the fetus is a female. In other words, can the power to know be used contrary to feminist philosophy in a sexist manner? As you might imagine, feminists are split over that issue. If one takes seriously the right of a woman to control her body, it's a no-brainer. Of course she should know. But because the issue is not choice, the issue is never choice. Why is the issue never choice? Because almost nobody believes in choice. Almost nobody believes in choice. Choice is rhetoric. People believe in your right to choose what they want you to choose. That is certainly the right to choice movement today. They want you to choose abortion. Do you have a right to choose not to have abortion? Do you have the right to read pornography? Do a little demographic and see how many people who favor the right to choose abortion also favor the right to choose reading pornography. You'll see a tremendous disparity. I think the right to choose is a phony. It is the right to the result. And we believe that if we give people the right to choose, most of them will choose the result we favor, and so it's much more easy to sell if we call it the right to choose. But if the vast majority of people chose differently from the way we would want them to choose, we would suddenly find a different rationale. So, Nat, why are you so surprised? I'm certainly not, that the world is filled with hypocrites on both sides. That, to me, is not necessarily a policy argument. Of course, you're right that pro-lifers favor life only until birth, then they favor orphanages, as well as pro-choices favor only people choosing what they want. Hypocrisy is rampant in public debate today. We see so many instances of people claiming one right in order to use it as a predicate for other rights. But it seems to me that one, therefore, should address the problem on its merits. If I had my 45 minutes, I would spell out the argument that I make for why, on balance, I prefer a woman's right to choose abortion. I don't think it's mandated by the Constitution. I don't think it's mandated by logic. I don't think it's mandated by God. I just prefer to live in a society, on balance, where that right is given to women, while at the same time fighting the extensions that you fight for. It's much of why I support freedom of speech. It's not God-given. Madison wasn't any smarter than people living today. I don't believe in the Constitution as a source of wisdom. On balance, I prefer to teach at a university where freedom of speech prevails and to live in a nation where freedom of speech prevails. Maybe when you get older you begin to reject absolutes. But I do believe that absolutes, whether the absolutes are in the interest of good or in the interest of bad, absolutes are a stopping point for thinking and for debate. Having said that, let me just end by congratulating Nat Hentoff for performing, I think, a very important public service. He is making us rethink our most fundamental beliefs. In my case, Nat, you will be sorry to hear that by making me rethink them, and I really do think very hard about every argument you make, you have caused me to strengthen my beliefs in a woman's right to choose. But for all of us, I think, we owe a great debt for making us rethink propositions that many of us have long taken for granted. Thank you.
You want to answer before we start questions?
Just a brief answer, and I must say in response to Alan's last point is I'll keep trying harder. After all, Bill Buckley told me the other night that he's going to try to convert me to Catholicism before, I forget whether it's before he dies or I die. And then I told him that when I introduced Cardinal O'Connor in Toronto at a pro-life rally, and the Cardinal said, "I'm delighted that Nat is not a Catholic because we have enough trouble in the church as it is." With response to drawing the line, we must draw the line. The line has been drawn in the sense that at the very beginning, once there's implantation, it is not an orangutan or a monkey or a rhinoceros. All the genetic concatenations of attributes that that child, if it becomes a child, will ever have are there. They're there. And they're unlike any others that came before him or her or others that follow. So the informed moral argument that leads to killing these human entities, if you want to call them that, is not, by my standards, very moral at all. And also in terms of drawing the line, this is not in direct response to Alan, but the arguments that I hear make me think of this. I've done a fair amount of studying of German medicine, during the 1920s and 1930s. There's been a lot of very valuable research there by young German doctors who want to prevent that ever happening again. And the slippery slopes there became chasms. It started out with they wanted national health insurance so that everyone would be covered, if you've heard that one before. But then the economy began to sour, so it couldn't be everybody. And also they began to look at the mentally handicapped and the chronically sick and people who cost an enormous amount of money to keep alive, and they decided that maybe they should be disposed of. So that the first gassing was not of Jews, but of these people, the mentally handicapped and the chronically ill, etc. The key word, or the three words, then as now, was quality of life. I give Hillary Rodham Clinton credit, grudgingly, because she was the only person in the administration who was honest about the health care reform bill. She appeared early on before the Senate Finance Committee and said, quality of life will determine on whom these monies are spent. And that, to me, was very chilling indeed. And that's why I keep talking about there's more to abortion than abortion. Once you get the sense, and these are decent people who kill these developing human beings, once you get the sense that a little killing is okay, because after all, these are not really people, then you go on to euthanasia, and then you go on to assisted suicide, and now we are at creating embryos for research purposes, embryos that after the research is done can be killed. And I'm about to write a piece on that. I'm going to start off with the notion that if Dr. Joseph Mengele is still alive, despite reports to the contrary, he might well be granted amnesty to come to America to work on this noble project.
All right, we come to the question period. Now, if you have questions, please come to one of the microphones here and identify yourself and ask a short question. Please don't give a speech. Do you want to just take one?
Sure. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Charles Goodman. I'm a sophomore at the college. I am a Buddhist and a vegetarian, and I am pro-choice. Now, I want to ask you, if, as both Buddhists and atheists do, you deny the existence of the soul, what's so important and special about people? Is the killing that goes on in slaughterhouses equally important in determining the brutality or the compassion of our national character? Do you propose, then, to use force to compel people not to eat steaks? Since if you eat a steak, you're participating in the destruction of a thing with a far more rich experience of the world, far more ability to feel pain, far more brain cells than a fetus. I want to say slippery slope arguments are difficult. Hitler, one of the first things he did when he came to power was prohibit abortion. Also, interestingly enough, Hitler was a vegetarian. So my question to you is, why would you not agree with Professor Dershowitz that there's a certain amount of choice involved in deciding what biological systems are the objects of our moral concern and what are not?
Well, since I am an atheist, I'm not God, and I don't want to make those decisions. For an atheist, at least for me, there is nothing else left but life. There is nothing transcending that. And as for your points, which I agree with, about slaughterhouses, and I'm an imperfect vegetarian myself, I have no intention, if I had the power, to force people to do anything. I don't even believe in criminalizing abortion. I believe in the ancient and ineffective idea that you can perhaps persuade some people to think again. So.
Thank you. That's not over there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Equal opportunity, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Avery Gardner. I'm a sophomore at the college and also a member of the Institute of Politics Student Advisory Committee. And I'd like to take the discussion away from the morality of abortion to what now is the debate about abortion that's facing us. We now have a society which has become very enraged over this topic, whether they're pro-choice or pro-life. We have people shooting physicians as they try to enter clinics. We have people blocking clinic doors. We have people throwing things at pro-life rallies. We have Harvard Harvard newspapers sending out issues with pictures of, not pictures of fetuses, but diagrams of an aborted fetus or of a coat hanger on the front cover, obviously meaning abortion. We've come to a point in the abortion debate which has become very violent. How do you feel about this polarization of the two sides of the issue, and how does that fall into accordance with your moral stance on abortion and on the rights and non-rights associated with it?
The only thing that's happened recently that gives me some confidence, not much, that what you're talking about, and you're entirely accurate, is not the only offshoot of the whole debate, is a coalition that's formed in Washington, and it includes NARAL, NOW, the Feminists for Life of America, and various both pro-life groups and pro-choice groups. And the reason for the coalition is that the President's welfare bill proposes that women who have another child while they're on welfare get no money for that child. I mean, you talk about Newt Gingrich, I don't think he could do much worse. Anyway, the coalition was formed to stop the Clinton bill. And once they have met, and apparently it's a coming together that gives both sides some degree of reason to think that they can work on other questions. One of the things that ought to be done is getting more research for contraceptives. We are way behind in this country on research, and I'm not talking about RU 486, the other kinds of contraceptives. There's also a group called Common Ground that has affiliates in small numbers in various states, and they get together to try to get some kind of common, try on the one hand to prevent abortions, and on the other hand to prevent the kind of stereotyping that pro-lifers do. I've seen this before in meetings between blacks and Jewish students, and similarly with pro-choice and pro-choice people. It takes a while, but after a while they begin seeing each other as stereotypes. Then all of us, not all of a sudden, but gradually, hey, I know you are a person, I know your name. It's a small thing, but it may spread. I mean, look at Gandhi, but then look how Gandhi died. However, yeah, I think there are people who want to do something about this instead of yell and scream at each other. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, my name is Stephen Morano. Just really quickly, I'm a pro-life independent, or if I had to lean one way or the other, I'd say I'm mostly, I believe in what Democrats believe in mostly, as opposed to Republicans. So I'm a pro-life Democrat, I could say that. And you seem to be like that. And
yeah.
I just want to say, if more people, let's say in charge and government or whatever, or in power, or with influence, more people are pro-life Democrats, and more people in the country are pro-life Democrats, I think that this country would be a lot better place, because the idea of death and killing in war and in abortion, everything is going to make people worse and make their lives worse. But one point I want to make really last point, really quickly, and I think it answers Mr. Dershowitz, because he's totally wrong in what he's saying, and he says he can't see where you're right, where you are. And the point is really quick. The point is really quickly is that what he said is wrong, and this is what he said. Okay, he says there's a woman's right to choose, but it isn't because of this. Because he says, for instance, if you're religious, then you believe in the soul and it's killing. Now, I'm religious, I'm Catholic, but that's not the reason why I believe it's wrong. It's not because I'm religious, because I am. But the point is that abortion is wrong, not because a religious reason, because it's murdering a human being. Nothing to do about religion, but it's a murder of a human being. So the point is that once conception starts, it's a growth of a human being, which is going to become an old man. So the point is that that's where he's wrong, and that's why it's immoral. The main thing is that that's why it's immoral and it's murder, because you're killing you're killing a human being, and that's the difference. And that's where he's got it wrong, because it's not just like, let me finish. It's not just like it's not just like you're religious and say it's a soul and stuff like that. Regardless of the fact if it has a soul or not. But I believe that fetuses and human beings have a soul, but the point is that it's a growing, living human being, so it's murder. That's why abortion.
Okay, I think we get your
last thing. That is why abortion should be made illegal, because it's killing a growing human being, and that's where Mr. Dershowitz has it wrong.
Okay,
thank you.
The comment about pro-life Democrats There always have been some. Many have been working-class Democrats who left the party for Reagan and Bush and then came back and now have left again. Some members of Congress who are liberals have been are pro-life, Mazzoli of Kentucky, etc. And the whip, David Bonnier, who was the only member of Congress who really knows the labor movement and tries to preserve it, and he's pro-life. But I don't see much happening in terms of Congress politically because, to my great surprise, the last elections resulted in the House in close to a majority of pro-lifers, and they were nowhere near that 2 years ago. So the Republican approach, the Republican approach now is they're going to cool it on abortion because they've already, Gingrich has gotten themselves in enough trouble with other things like prayer and 1/4 of the White House staff taking drugs. I was told by somebody I trust in the hierarchy that the secular hierarchy, that they're going to wait 9 months, and then they don't plan to do anything radical because they don't have the votes to overcome a filibuster, or not a filibuster, but a presidential veto. They're going to try to weaken the face bill, the bill that said that you can be punished if you obstruct abortion clinics, whether peaceably or not. And they're going to take the Casey decision of the Supreme Court, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which opened a few doors to legislation. But they don't intend, I think, for a long time to come, if ever, to bring up the human life bill again, which would make fetuses persons under the Constitution. But all of that, the momentum is with them. I mean, with the Republicans. So I don't see much action with pro-life Democrats, except possibly on a local and state level. Robert Casey, when he was governor of Pennsylvania, was one of the most liberal Democratic governors in many, many years, and he was pro-life, and he influenced a lot of people for the time being. But I think, as I say, the momentum now is with Gingrich and company. Yes.
Joel Roslin, Harvard Divinity School. I want to thank you for taking such a position and challenging those of us who think we know what we think. And my question for you is, seeing as how the sides are so polarized that pro-life stance is often a never abortion and a pro-life, pro-choice stance is under any conditions, do you think that we have any possibility of moving towards a point where there might be certain limits or certain giving that we might have on either side that might bring us to a position that might not be so divisive? And I'd also be curious to hear if Professor Dershowitz would answer that from a legal point.
I think that except for those people I mentioned who formed this coalition in Washington, who are active in common ground activities around the country, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to have any kind of real coming together of the forces on fundamental levels. The fundamental level is it life? And if it's life, how can you kill it? The point that gentleman was making. I mean, the pro-life people, and it's not true, as I think Alan implied, that a majority of them by any means are with Bonnie Frank, that you're pro-life until the moment of birth. There are an awful lot of social activists in the pro-life movement. Not only the ones who came out of the peace movement and the civil rights movement, but people who are now working in poor neighborhoods or teaching in poor schools. The stereotype of the pro-lifer as somebody who is quite old and quite rigid, it just isn't true. There are some who are, but they believe totally that human life is being killed, and they're not about to. How do you compromise on that? The other side believes just as strongly and just as honestly. My wife keeps telling me that I am breeding social mischief, and that a woman cannot be liberated unless she has complete power over her body, and she's never going to change. So there'll be some comings together on discrete issues or discrete campaigns, but I don't think the chasm will ever be really closed. You wanted to answer it, yeah.
Yeah, I think this is the one question that really, better than any other, proves my point. If you're right, and this is really life, then of course it can never get less divisive. If I believed, as you did, that over 1 million human beings were being murdered every year, I would not be here tonight. I would be out on the street, in the barricades, doing what I have said that others should have done when 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis. If I believed that human lives were at stake and that people were being promiscuously murdered that way, there would be no cause for compromise. And in fact, because of that, it seems to me your argument is much more dangerous in some respects. Because what you're really saying is, I believe that these are human beings, and I believe they're being murdered, but I'm not all that upset about it. I'm not going to make it criminal. I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm going to get up and make an occasional brilliant speech in the hope that maybe I'll convince a few people. You know, listening to you, Nat, really I've come to the conclusion you're pro-choice, but you want people to choose life because you're not willing. Is that a contradiction? Well, no. I think you're saying you don't want to criminalize. If you don't want to criminalize, in some respects you're pro-choice. You're saying people have the right to choose, but you think it's wrong to choose one way and they should choose another way, that you are really drawing a line. You're saying it's life, but it's not life. If it were really life, I know you well enough to know we'd be marching out there together. So how can you justify believing it's life and simply sitting at the lecture table and not doing more about it, as you know I would do and I know you would do, if really we were talking about 1 million innocent adults being murdered every year?
I have talked for a long time with the people in Operation Rescue, and I've watched what they do, and what they do is totally counterproductive in terms of life. The counselors, and in that respect, you might be right. If I knew how to do it, I could learn. The people, I know some women who counsel outside clinics, and they claim that they have turned some women home, not to abort. But the kind of grandiose Kirk Douglas scenario you just posed for yourself and me has nothing to do with the realities of the situation here in the United States. You create more support for abortion if you commit the kind of civil disobedience that Operation Rescue, and God knows they're sincere, has done, and the Lambs of God and all those folks, and good old Paul Hill. I mean, why don't you extend it? I should get myself a gun and get a list of all the abortionists in New York and get them one after another, right?
No, I would do that.
You would do that?
If they were Mengele, I would do that.
Ah, but they're not Mengele.
Why are they not Mengele?
Because this is a different culture. We have laws, unlike Germany, which have had pretend laws. And the reason I don't believe in criminalizing abortion is you create martyrs. You don't change anybody's mind that way by putting them in jail. You put the woman in jail, you put the doctor in jail, you're going to have Harriet Tubman risen again with a new underground. No, all this stuff it's an interesting polemical point, but it has nothing to do with you know what saves lives more than anything else, certainly more than what you're talking about. Those marvelous ads, television ads, and that the networks are finally running. They didn't want to for a while. Life is a beautiful choice. That's the way to go. Not opposing the killing of fetuses by killing other people. That makes no sense.
You are pro-choice.
No.
Life is a beautiful choice.
Oy vey. I tell you, it's like arguing with Al Gore. Yeah. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Somebody over there.
Okay. My name is Lisa Kelly, and I'm a second year in the Masters of Public Policy program here. And I'm interested. There is a group of us who will be starting a dialogue on this subject. It's a small directed readings group.
Yeah.
By no means a class at Harvard. But I would like to have some either words of wisdom on how to approach the subject. Our specific intent is not to push an agenda, not one side, not the other, but to grapple with it as policy students. And I'd like to know how, as students, we should approach the issue.
I think reading, to begin with, makes a lot of sense. If you like, give me a call in New York. I'm in the phone book, and I'll give you some ideas. But there's a woman named Crossan, Cynthia Crossan, I think her name is, in Syracuse, who goes all over the country and now went off to Newfoundland to start a Common Ground chapter, and she's very good at this sort of stuff. There's a book called Rachel Weeping. I hope it's not totally out of print. It's by a guy who used to teach at Notre Dame. His name was Berchatell, something like Berchatell. And you also, I think, ought to... I can't give you much in terms of the pro-choice literature because I'm not very conversant with it, but the National Right to Life Committee, which is quite calm, puts out a newspaper every other week, some of which is very good. It involves more than abortion. It gets into euthanasia and embryo research and the like. But I think what you probably most would find useful are people who have done this. Helen Alvarez, another person. She's with the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, but she's very hip and unlike the stereotype of somebody who works for the National Conference of Catholic. Give me a call in New York and I'll get you some names.
This has to be our last question.
Last question, I'm told.
Okay. I'm Nicholas Wallerstein, graduate student at Harvard Divinity School. I actually have a question for Professor Dershowitz, if that's okay. Professor Dershowitz, how would you respond to someone like me who believes that a woman has perhaps even a natural right to abortion and should certainly have a legal right to abortion, but has questions about the Roe v. Wade decision? Was it a good decision, or do you have problems with it?
I think Roe versus Wade was, from a pro-choice point of view, one of the worst decisions ever rendered by the United States Supreme Court, because it took the issue of abortion, which should have been a political issue, because people are equally divided in this country, and because rational debate should prevail, and because if you agree, as I do, that there's a line-drawing exercise, and line-drawing must be a matter of politics, not a matter of judicial imprimatur. So from a point of view of what judges should do, it was a terrible decision. From the point of view of the pro-choice movement, it was a terrible decision because it relegated the power to decide a woman's right to choose abortion to 9 men and made the movement lazy and sloppy. And in fact, I think one of the reasons Ronald Reagan was elected president and George Bush were elected president is because they were able to posture about abortion and get all the pro-life votes, including the old Labor Democrats, because they knew there was a parachute. There was never going to be a real change in abortion policy in this country because Roe versus Wade had constitutionalized and depoliticized the issue. It put the right of a woman to choose abortion in great danger because as the court moved, in my view, rightward, and Roe versus Wade came to be questioned, the political base for maintaining a woman's right to choose politically had eroded. By the way, it was unnecessary, Roe versus Wade, in every Western European country in 1973, 1974, 1972. A woman's right to abortion was recognized. Only in this country was it recognized judicially. In every other country it was recognized politically. It was a right whose time had come. And so I am a strong pro-choice advocate who opposes Roe versus Wade. Therefore, I am ineligible to be nominated to the United States Supreme Court by President Clinton. Thank God for that.
Well, thanks so much, Nat Hentoff, and thank you to Alan Dershowitz for making this a lively and thoughtful debate.